The year is 1486 before Christ, exactly 40 years before the waters parted. Forget the images of marble corridors. Forget the smell of incense in the great temples and the protection of armed palace guards. The man destined to rewrite the fate of an entire nation is now crouching next to a shallow well. He dug it with his own bare hands, right in the unforgiving dirt of the Midian desert. His skin is burned by the punishing sun. His hands, once used to holding papyrus and golden goblets, now show thick calluses from pulling rough ropes and lifting heavy burdens. The tent where he rests at night has no cedar roof. It is woven from thick goat skin. This nomadic camp belongs to Jethro. He is a respected priest who controls vital grazing rights, covering a vast area of nearly 80 square miles. In that landscape of extreme isolation, there are no scribes documenting the passage of time. There is no military hierarchy to impose order and protect the vulnerable. The only law that rules is dictated by thirst. Rain, when it decides to bless the land, falls in minimal amounts only twice a year. Any trace of green in the landscape exists briefly, in temporary valleys that dry up just as quickly as they appear. It is an environment designed to break the unprepared. Moses takes on the heavy burden of guarding mixed flocks, made up of restless goats and sheep. At the peak of the scorching summer, these animals succumb quickly if they do not drink water every 36 hours. The margin for error is non-existent. A single miscalculation about the exact distance to the next hydration point means the total loss of the flock. It means the ruin of the family that took them in. Grazing routes offer no certainties. They shift constantly, shaped by the unpredictable whims of the weather, and groundwater carries a heavy price. To keep his animals on their feet, he must engage in exhausting daily negotiations with local Bedouin tribes. These are rigid clans who control the few permanent wells in that vastness of sand and stone. The former prince learns the hard way how to yield, how to forge strategic alliances, and how to pay the silent toll imposed by the laws of the desert. Far from the eyes of the court, the mind sharpened in the wisdom centers of Egypt begins to rewire itself. He learns to decode nearly invisible tracks in the barren gravel to deduce exactly where the water table is hiding. He starts to identify small roots and specific plants that only survive when water is just a few feet below the surface. He becomes an expert in calculating how many animals can drink from a single well before the bottom yields only mud and dry dust. There were no crowds to witness his struggle. There was no prestige in that anonymous routine, covered in sweat and dirt. But with every spring mapped and every route mastered under the oppressive midday heat, the isolation was forging a master of logistical survival. He did not know it yet, but the topography he was burning into his memory would be the exact map that 4 decades later would keep 600,000 people from perishing in the dark of the wilderness. Before we venture deeper into the desert and witness the silent making of the man who would challenge the greatest empire of the ancient world, I quickly ask for your like. It helps this documentary reach more people, and it greatly supports all the rigorous research done to bring this story to you. And so I can better know who is joining us on this journey today, leave your answer in the comments. Do you enjoy studying the Bible on your own? Are you part of a congregation? Or are you simply passionate about the great mysteries of ancient history and archaeology? I will read and answer every comment with great attention. Thank you so much for the support. Now, let us return to the sands of Midian. The calendar reads roughly 1480 before Christ. 6 heavy years have already passed since the fugitive crossed the Egyptian border. The transition from prince to shepherd is complete. The choices he makes now have nothing to do with grand revolutions or apparent divine purposes. They are purely about not dying under the unforgiving sun. Moses agrees to marry Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro. Popular history usually focuses only on the family aspect of this union, but in the ruthless desert of the Middle East, a marriage carries a crucial logistical weight. By joining the priest's family, he is not just building a home, he is securing permanent grazing rights in a territory where access to water dictates who lives and who does not survive until the next season. The marriage officially weaves him into the complex web of survival in Midian. With this new position comes physical, exhausting responsibility. He takes direct management of about 400 head of mixed livestock. That number of animals in an arid environment is a daily ticking time bomb. They must be moved constantly between 3 grazing areas, relying strictly on the seasonal rains. During the winter, when temperatures drop and dry valleys quickly fill with water rushing down the mountains, he leads the flock along the northern route. At the peak of summer, the strategy changes drastically. The southern route becomes the only refuge. That is where the deepest artesian wells stay active, even when the surface of the earth cracks from the drought. Moving hundreds of animals is not just a matter of walking. It is a continuous exercise in raw diplomacy. The desert is not no man's land. Every corridor between pastures, every mountain shadow, and every water spring is controlled by ancient territorial Bedouin clans. To cross these lands in peace, the former prince must negotiate tolls almost every single day. The currency is not gold or silver. He pays with young goats, wool, and access concessions to water sources that Jethro's family commands. The tension hits its peak when natural cycles fail. In one scorching summer, a shared well, which his flock critically relied on, dries up months earlier than expected. The bottom reveals only hardened mud. With 400 animals on the verge of collapse, Moses is forced to act fast. He rides to the camp of a neighboring clan and negotiates emergency access to their water reserve. Since he has no spare animals to offer at that moment, he trades his own sweat. He offers weeks of intense manual labor to dig a brand new well the following season, all in exchange for the water that would keep his flock standing that day. He learns to back down. He learns the value of a given word among men living on the fringes of civilization. He learns to build a solid network of favors, alliances, and escape routes. Without realizing it, the shepherd is paving his own future. 34 years later, he would be on those exact same trails. He would need to negotiate with those same tribes. He would need to find the very same hidden water sources. But next time, he would not be leading 400 scared animals. He would be guiding 600,000 people across a territory he now knew like the back of his hand. The calendar moves forward to the year 1456 before Christ. 30 years have already been consumed by the vastness and the oppressive silence of Midian. Moses now finds himself on the southern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba. A shallow, barren valley rests before him, It holds the last traces of moisture left by a passing rain that rolled down the Sinai Mountains days ago. The heavy silence of the landscape is broken only by the steady sound of 800 moving animals. He is not standing there by chance. The former prince is conducting an extreme endurance test. He is mapping in his own skin the complete route connecting Midian to the heart of the peninsula. The logistical challenge is terrifying. He needs to cross about 175 miles of hostile land, sharp rocks, and choking dust. His goal is to lose no more than 10% of his flock along the way. In the harshness of the ancient world, any miscalculation passing that margin meant the absolute economic collapse of the entire camp. It is at this moment that his mind, educated in the highest schools of the empire, turns entirely to the ruthless math of survival. Over the long journey, Moses identifies and memorizes 14 crucial points along the way. 14 exact locations where groundwater can be reached by digging less than 6 feet into the coarse sand and gravel. He records in his memory the precise walking time and the exact distance between each of these vital stops. A 12-hour mistake in the march would mean finding a dry well. That would seal the fate of everyone depending on his leadership. More than mapping hidden wells and springs, he understands the rhythm of the Sinai climate. It becomes clear that a safe, large-scale crossing is only truly possible in 2 very short specific windows each year. The first opportunity comes in the spring. The second is during the fall, exactly when the deep valleys still hold the rare moisture reserves of the season. Outside these exact periods, the desert turns into an inescapable furnace, one capable of quickly swallowing any caravan. Along these winding trails, the lone shepherd begins to cross paths with the ancient trade routes of the region. He meets men weathered by time, travelers hauling copper blocks from the mines of Timnah. In these encounters, Moses continues to exercise his tactical diplomacy. He negotiates with Bedouin leaders for the right to access deep waters in foreign territory. The toll is paid on the spot. He hands over meat and some of his precious rams in exchange for the right to keep the rest of the group alive. Every pit dug into the earth, every deal sealed with the nomads, and every mile measured in his own footsteps were actually forming a massive survival simulation. Moses had mastered the complex art of moving a massive volume of life through a terrain that forgives no weakness. He did it in absolute anonymity. He would look at the herd of 800 head of cattle and calculate the exact logistics to keep them standing. He had no idea, but 10 years later, the scenario would be exactly the same. He would be retracing this path stone by stone. The difference is that next time, the responsibility would be on a terrifying scale. He would be leading over 500,000 exhausted, fleeing people, carrying those very same rams as currency, and depending on the exact same hidden wells he had just mapped. The calendar moves forward again. We arrive at roughly the year 1470 before Christ. We are exactly 24 years away from the event that would divide the saltwater and human history itself. When we open the pages of the sacred text today and read about Israel's exhausting march through the Sinai Peninsula, our modern Western minds project a very specific image. It is shaped by centuries of paintings, traditions, and movies. We imagine an absolute void, an endless silent ocean of dead sand, unexplored dunes, and barren mountains, where a newly freed people walked completely blind. A people hoping the heavens would step in at every sunrise just so they would not perish from thirst and hunger. But archaeology and the untold history beneath the sand reveal a dramatically different scene. The Sinai desert was not empty. It was alive, pulsing, and above all, meticulously mapped. That vast stretch of limestone and sharp granite was, in fact, crossed by relentless and ancient trade routes. They were dirt paths beaten down by the weight of time, connecting the rich copper mines of the Timna region straight to the commercial heart of the Nile River Delta. Heavy caravans carrying valuable loads had been crossing those hostile sands for at least 300 years. And for men and beasts of burden to survive this open-air furnace, a network of mandatory rest stops was established. They were hidden refuges from the fury of the sun. They were marked by underground wells, dug centuries earlier by the calloused hands of Nabatean tribes and nomads. The man who would one day lead the escape from Egypt knew every single one of those refuges by name. Take the famous camp of Rephidim, for instance. The sacred account describes the arrival of the Hebrews at this site in a moment of extreme tension. Men and women were crying out for water under the weight of despair. But decades before that chaos, the lone shepherd had already camped there. He knew perfectly well that beneath that dry ground there were 3 shallow wells. They were capable of providing up to 500 gallons of water a day. Right at the oppressive peak of summer, he did not have to guess. He knew exactly where and how deep to dig. He also knew the visual secrets of Elim by heart. When the exhausted people celebrated finding the 12 springs of water and rested under the shade of 70 palm trees, the Hebrew leader was not marveling at a happy coincidence. He knew how to read the landscape tactically. In the desert, palm trees do not grow by accident. They act as a vital natural lighthouse. They indicate with unquestionable precision that the water table is flowing strong less than 12 feet below ground. And there was Kadesh Barnea, the ultimate converging point of 3 distinct trade routes. That was not just any patch of sand. It was a solid geographical sanctuary. It had enough water capacity to sustain oases and camps of over 200 tents for long weeks. Every well and every trickle of water on this massive chessboard was fiercely controlled by specific territorial clans. For more than 2 decades, the former Egyptian prince sat around campfires with these rugged leaders. He drank water from clay cups and negotiated complex rites of passage. He strictly paid his toll with young rams and fine wool fabrics. Understanding the scriptures this way, seeing the real geography, the strict logistics, and the tangible historical backdrop behind every event, completely transforms our faith. We stop seeing isolated stories and start seeing the grand, silent engineering of God at work throughout the centuries. And if you wish to have this same clear, deep, and historical vision for the entire Bible, I want to extend a very special, warm invitation. We have prepared a resource with extreme care, historical respect, and theological precision. It is our ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order.pdf. Inside, we reorganized all the sacred events, from the majesty of creation in the book of Genesis to the final revelations of the New Jerusalem in Revelation, all following the exact timeline of when the facts occurred. This material is incredibly rich. It is filled with detailed timelines and infographics that will help you connect the patriarchs, the Babylonian exile, and the days of Jesus in a way you may have never experienced before. The link to access this file is right below in the description and also pinned in the comments. I am certain it will be an invaluable tool for your journey of study and connection with the Word. Returning now to the ancient roots of the Sinai, the great historical revelation finally takes shape when 600,000 people stepped onto the eastern shore of the Red Sea for the first time, turning their backs on the war chariots sinking in the mud. They were not walking into the dark. They were not marching aimlessly under the suffocating heat, left to chance. They followed the exact survival infrastructure that the copper roots and the experienced nomads already used to cross the ancient world safely. At the front of that massive, vulnerable, and loud crowd walked an 80-year-old man. He wore clothes marked by the harsh weather, and he carried in his hand only a simple wooden staff. In the eyes of the newly freed Hebrews, and in the eyes of many generations to come, he was simply the vessel for heavenly miracles. But in the hard, mathematical, and ruthless geography of that ancient desert, he was the supreme master of survival, a strategist molded in silence, who spent 4 decades learning exactly beneath which rock formation every single drop of life was hidden. The calendar of antiquity marks the year 1446 before Christ. It is the exact moment the Exodus narrative cements itself as the foundational event of the people of Israel. We return to the exact second when the towering waters of the Red Sea crashed down with a deafening roar upon the Pharaoh's military elite. On the other side of the shore, the silence that follows the chaos is heavy, almost suffocating. Men, women, and children fall to their knees on the dark, damp gravel. Their lungs are burning from the absurd effort of the march. Their eyes are still locked on the liquid vastness that just swallowed their captors. For that exhausted and traumatized crowd, this was the absolute climax, the final frontier of the impossible. But for the aging man now lowering his staff, feeling the salty breeze on his face, this was not an isolated miracle. It was the starting point of a monumental engine he had spent his entire life building in the absolute darkness of anonymity. Moses looked at the barren land of limestone, rock, and sand stretching out before him, fading into the horizon. He did not see the void. He did not see the unknown or the end of the line. He saw his old, unforgiving training ground. 14,600 days. That was the exact time he spent walking, bleeding, sweating, and mapping that hard dirt before finding the courage to return to Egypt and confront the most powerful empire on earth. Every wind-worn mountain peak, every hidden curve of the dry valleys, and every strategic shadow cast by the giant boulders at noon were old, intimate acquaintances. When the dust of the escape finally settled and the fleeting rush of freedom gave way to the relentless thirst of the endless march, the leader of Israel did not have to improvise. He did not call an emergency council to guess the direction. He simply triggered the muscle memory forged in 40 long years of forced isolation. The colossal crossing that followed toward Mount Sinai was not a random panic-driven march. The intricate routes that thousands of Hebrews followed, step by step, were strictly the same ones Moses had walked under the harsh sun with priest Jethro's restless flocks. Between the years of 1486 and 1446 before Christ, When the camp was set up in the harsh region of Rephidim and the crowd collapsed, turning against him in deep despair over the visible lack of water, he ordered the rock to be struck in a millimeter-precise location. He was not testing his luck or waiting on chance. His sharpened mind quickly accessed the visual and geographic file built almost 2 decades earlier. Back when he used that exact same rock formation, that same peculiar porous limestone, to locate the water table that saved his cattle from deadly thirst. The Exodus was, without a doubt, a monumental event of indescribable spiritual proportions. But its daily execution relied on a cold, calculating, ironclad logistics. The survival and progress of those 12 tribes did not rest solely on the provision raining down from the heavens. The march rested on the hypervigilant mind of a strategist, a man who knew from his own experience that the perfect weather window to move that massive human wave was right then and there. He knew how to calculate the exact pace needed to reach the next great oasis of Elim before the pitchers and water reserves ran completely dry. He knew ahead of time in which stone corridors the ancient Bedouin clans would be lurking. He knew how to negotiate peace without stepping into direct conflict, paying heavy territorial tolls with the cattle they had hurriedly brought out of Egypt. Absolutely nothing was left to chance. That brutal desert was not an unbeatable enemy. It was a complex topographic tool he had already learned to master. Try to visualize and feel the crushing psychological weight resting on the shoulders of this solitary man. During the ruthless glare of the day, he endured the complaints, the fears, and the threats of a people who, though their hands and feet were free from chains, still carried the bitter mindset of slavery rooted deep in their souls. They grumbled about the fatigue. They missed the predictability of Egypt. They were absolutely certain they would die forgotten in the boiling sand. But it was at night, while the massive camp plunged into an exhausted silence under the biting desert cold, that Moses truly carried his burden. Sitting alone, lit only by the embers of a dying fire, he looked at the starry sky and mentally calculated the distance to the converging point of Kadesh Barnea. He knew full well that the next 38 years of that generation would be shaped and defined by those dusty crossroads. The silent leader bore the unbearable weight of being the vital bridge between the extraordinary provision of heaven and the lethal, unforgiving dust of the earth. The terrifying plagues sent to the heart of the empire forced the great gates of Egypt wide open. The sea, split in half, shattered the chains of war hunting them down. But it was the deep geographic knowledge, the physical resilience, and the logistical patience carved out the hard way during years of exile that kept that emerging nation from total collapse in their very first months of freedom. The grand stage of salvation was already set. The hostile sets were already inspected down to the inch. When nobody was paying attention, when the upper ranks of the ancient world believed the prince had vanished forever, swallowed by the shadows of total irrelevance, he was actually mapping out the escape route of the greatest revolution in human history. The outcome was never tied to improvisation. Freedom was not just declared by divine decree. It was marched, calculated step by step, well by well, dust by dust. It was an invisible process where eternity and human resilience worked together in an eerie, silent synchrony. The dust has finally settled. Exactly 3 months have passed since the last chariot of the Egyptian Empire vanished under the crushing weight of the salt water. The calendar points to the year 1446 before Christ. The exhausting march through the unforgiving desert has brought the massive crowd of Hebrews to the base of a formidable, intimidating rock formation. We stand before the majestic Mount Sinai, the exact spot where the divine covenant would be sealed and the foundational law would be handed down to mankind. For the over 2 million men, women, and children now camped on the barren plain, that mountain of dark granite is a scene of reverent terror. The peak is completely shrouded in thick clouds, heavy and dark as coal. The continuous deafening sound of thunder makes the gravel floor shake beneath their bare feet. Flashes of lightning violently tear the desert sky, announcing a presence the human mind can barely handle. The people are frightened and in absolute awe. They pull back instinctively, overcome by the sheer dread of even touching the base of the sacred mount. But there is one man there who does not step back. He does not tremble. An 80-year-old man, his face deeply carved by the sun's wrinkles, his calloused hands resting firmly on a worn wooden staff. He looks up at that stormy peak with a silent, almost nostalgic familiarity. To the newborn nation of Israel, that raw territory is the absolute unknown. It is the uncrossable border between the sacred and the mortal. To Moses, it is the backyard of his old home. The text in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 1, records a historic geographical detail. It completely shifts our lens and our understanding of everything happening in this exact chronological moment, decades before this monumental day, when he was still just an anonymous shepherd, a fugitive with a bounty on his head in the neighboring empire. Moses tended to priest Jethro's flock in this exact same spot. It was right here, on the dry slopes of this very isolated mountain, that he saw the bush burning in intense flames, the one that defied physics and refused to turn to ashes, while the crowd camped below sees only the consuming fire and the thick smoke. Moses' memory races back to the long days of absolute silence. He knows exactly, step by step, how long it takes to climb that jagged peak. He knows every ravine hidden by the rocks, every narrow and treacherous path between the sharp stones. He knows perfectly well which slopes offer some relief and shade when the midday sun tries to melt the earth. The spot chosen by Providence to deliver the 10 Commandments, the place to found the entire legal, moral, and spiritual system of the nation of Israel, was not some random, unknown stage. It was the old manual labor route of a man who spent decades believing his life was over as far as history was concerned. Stop for a moment and look closely at the masterful grandeur of this historical design. We, as human beings, have a hasty tendency to categorically separate the sacred from the ordinary. We give a standing ovation to visible, spectacular miracles, like waters divided into walls, and the 10 devastating plagues that wiped out Egypt. But we often ignore and despise the ruthless, silent school of routine, the divine revelation that came down to earth, the one that would forever change the course of human civilization, ethics, and law, happened in the exact territory that Moses had already mastered to exhaustion as a simple goat herder in the Midian desert. All those decisions that seemed minor, trivial, ordinary, and even frustrating 40 years ago now converged. They made overwhelming sense. Accepting the marriage to Zipporah, far from the luxuries of the Nile, was not just about starting a family in exile. It was the master diplomatic key to secure grazing rights and vital access to water, mapping the old forgotten trade routes, negotiating heavy tolls with ruthless Bedouin clan leaders, whose rugged dialects the scribes in the pharaoh's palace could not even grasp, learning to calculate the exact depth of the water tables by digging the burning sand with his bare hands. Absolutely none of it was just pure and simple survival. None of it was a punishment of wasted time. It was, in fact, the highest furnace of mental, psychological, and spiritual preparation in the ancient world. He was building the precise infrastructure and the deep geographical knowledge that, decades later, would make the great Exodus a living reality. Without the endurance forged in the pain and sweat of those 40 invisible years, the crowd of ex-slaves would have died tragically in the very first week after crossing the sea. The man who had the unbreakable courage to defy a powerful god-king right inside the courts of Egypt only succeeded because, long before that, he learned to defy and beat the deadly fury of the desert. And right here lies the great question, one that remains alive, sharp, and pulsing, echoing from the ancient stones of the Sinai all the way to the walls of our modern days. It is a question that breaks the barrier of antiquity and crashes right into our own intimate reality. How many choices do you make today that feel like just heavy routine, stressful survival, or even a long season of frustration, but are actually silently setting the stage for something immeasurably greater? How many dry and difficult roads are you being forced to map right now, working in anonymity, in silence, with zero applause, just so that in the near future you will know exactly how to guide yourself, your family, and others through times of deep crisis? We are heavily wired to expect only great spectacles, to look for massive interventions that tear through the heavens and change our reality in the blink of an eye. But the true, widely documented history of the man who led the greatest liberation movement of antiquity teaches us an infinitely more mature and powerful lesson. True, solid greatness is not born on a bright, comfortable stage. It is forged in the choking dust. It is built methodically on those cold mornings when you wake up, do your duty with strict excellence, and just keep moving forward, even when absolutely no one is paying attention to your grind. When Moses finally came down from the peak of Mount Sinai, carrying the priceless weight of the tablets of the law, he was not just a leader delivering the foundation of divine commandments. He was living proof in flesh, bone, and scars that not a single day of honest learning is wasted. No hardened callus on your hands and no tear shed in anonymity is ever truly lost. Everything, absolutely everything, is part of a grand, silent, and flawless architecture. Let this deep dive into ancient history serve as an eternal reminder. Your desert today might be the exact precious map that secures your great victory tomorrow. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this dense and emotional cinematic reconstruction. If this historical documentary expanded your vision and strengthened your mind, I ask you to subscribe to the channel. Leave your comment to support our research and share this piece with someone who desperately needs to understand the massive value of the invisible process. I will see you in our next gathering, walking together along the dusty, mysterious, and eternal roots of the Scriptures.